Stop whatever you are doing. I want you to picture this. It's the year 624 CE. You are utterly outnumbered, not just by a few, but by 3 to 1. You are tired, you are hungry, and you are far from home. Your entire world fits into a small band of people, barely 300 strong. And you are standing in the desert, staring down an army of 1,000 fully kitted, angry warriors who want one thing: to wipe you out. This is not a movie. This is the moment a small group of believers stood against a superpower. This is the story of Badr. And honestly, it's one of the most unbelievable comeback stories in history. Stick around, because the details of this fight, they are wild. But to get to this impossible battle, we have to rewind a few years. We have to understand why these 300 people were even in the desert in the first place. This story doesn't begin on a battlefield. It begins with a decade of abuse. For 10 years in the city of Mecca, a small, growing community of people believed in one God, not the many idols of their city. Their leader, the Prophet Muhammad, was calling for a completely new way of life. The people of Mecca, the Quraysh tribe, hated this. They saw it as a threat to their business, their power, and their traditions. So they did what bullies do. They persecuted them. They tortured them. They tried to starve them. It got so bad that the believers had to pack up everything, leave their homes, their businesses, their lives, and secretly escape to a city called Medina, hundreds of miles away. This escape, the Hijra, was their rebirth. It was a chance to finally build a life of peace. They thought they were safe in Medina. They were wrong. The Meccan leadership, the power brokers who owned all the trade routes, they couldn't stand the idea of a successful rival community just sitting there. They started sending threats. They started pressuring the people of Medina to kick them out. They wanted them gone permanently. Now, here's where the high-stakes chess game begins. The Meccan trade caravan, hundreds of camels, loaded with goods, coming back from Syria. This caravan was basically the entire economy of Mecca, and it was going to pass right next to Medina. This wasn't just stuff. It was the money that fueled the very persecution they had just fled. The believers in Medina saw a chance, not to destroy their enemies, but to cripple their financial ability to launch a full-scale war. The plan was simple: intercept the caravan. But here's the problem, the big, massive oh-no moment. The caravan's leader, a guy named Abu Sufyan, was smart. He sensed danger. He sent a frantic messenger back to Mecca, begging for help. He told them, "Your money is in danger. Your honor is at stake." The Meccans didn't hesitate. They didn't send a security detail. They sent an entire army. Around 1,000 men, the biggest fighting force they could muster, marched out of Mecca, not to protect the caravan anymore, but to completely crush the new community in Medina. The game just changed from a raid to an existential war. So hold that thought. The caravan, the original target, sneaks away. It's safe. But the army is still coming. And now the 313 believers, who only left Medina with the tools for a quick skirmish, have to face a fully equipped army. The odds are 3 to 1, but the mental odds, they were 1,000,000 to 1. And what happened next is why we are still talking about this moment, almost 1,400 years later. The Prophet Muhammad received the news, the caravan escaped, and the army of the Quraysh, led by their fiercest general, Abu Jahl, was closing in. Imagine the meeting.
Everyone realized the terrifying reality. They were not chasing loot anymore. They were about to fight for their lives, their families back in Medina, and the existence of their faith. Most of them were not professional soldiers. They were farmers, traders, and laborers. They maybe had 70 camels and 2 horses among the whole group. Two horses! So, the prophet called a meeting with his followers. He didn't order them. He asked for their opinion. He said, "What do you say?" This is such a key moment. He was testing their faith and their resolve. The first 2 groups, the emigrants from Mecca, stood up and said, "We are with you no matter what." That's expected. They're his lifelong friends. But the most important people to hear from were the Ansars, the believers from Medina. Their initial pact to protect the prophet only covered threats within their city walls. This was outside the city. They had every right to say, "Sorry, this is outside the contract. We're going home." Silence. Then a man named Sa'd ibn Mu'az stood up, and what he said completely changes the feeling of the entire story. Sa'd looked at the prophet and said something incredible. He said, "O messenger of God, do you mean us? We believe in you and what you brought. We swear by God, if you were to ask us to go to the sea and plunge into it, we would plunge into it with you. We will not say what the people of Moses said, 'You and your Lord go and fight, and we will stay here.' Rather, we say, 'You and your Lord go and fight, and we will fight alongside you.'" Can you imagine that? They went from a group facing certain destruction to a unit ready to die for a cause. This isn't just a military decision. It's a moment of spiritual clarity. The feel was still there, but now it was overshadowed by an absolute, total dedication. The prophet was so happy. He told them, "March on and be happy, for God has promised me one of the 2 parties, either the caravan or the army. And by God, I can see the places where the enemy leaders will fall." The believers marched to a place called Badr, a desert area near a key set of water wells. Even their location was part of the plan. A follower named Al-Hubab ibn al-Mundar, a military mind, spoke up. He asked the prophet, "Is this the spot God commanded us to stop at, or is it a matter of military strategy?" The prophet said it was strategy. Hubab immediately advised, "Then let's move forward and camp at the nearest well to the enemy, fill up the other wells, and only leave our well open. That way, they have to fight us for water." This simple move was massive. It denied the giant Meccan army easy access to the most basic necessity, water. It forced them to attack on your terms. The 313 now had the advantage of position, psychology, and water supply. The Meccan army was about to march a long distance only to find the water source controlled by their enemy. The psychological warfare had begun before the first arrow was even fired. So the lines are drawn. The 313 are set up on the high ground, controlling the water. The 1,000-man army is approaching, thirsty and arrogant. The night before the battle is where the real story, the spiritual story, takes hold. This is the part that explains how the impossible happened. Don't go anywhere, because the next moments are when everything is on the line. Let's look at the enemy first. The Meccan army was celebrating. They were confident to the point of foolishness. They had the numbers, they had the weapons, and they truly believed this would be a simple mop-up operation. Their leader, Abu Jahl, was a man consumed by pride. Even when a few of his own men advised caution, reminding them the believers were their own relatives, Abu Jahl dismissed it. He was focused on one thing: humiliation. He wanted to crush the believers, kill the prophet, and parade their corpses back to Mecca to show everyone who was really in charge. Now shift to the other side, the camp of the 313. It was silent. It was a night of total submission. While the enemy was feasting, the believers were praying. The prophet spent the whole night in continuous prayer in a small tent set up for him. He was not just praying for victory, he was praying for the survival of his message. The prophet's prayer at Badr is legendary. At one point, he raised his hand so high that his cloak fell off his shoulder. He prayed with a passion that shook the very core of his companions. He was begging God, "O God, if this small group is destroyed, you will not be worshipped on the earth."
Again, this was the moment where everything was truly laid bare. It wasn't about land or wealth. It was about whether this new idea of a single God would survive the night. Then something happened that everyone saw as a sign. A heavy, sudden rain began to fall, but it wasn't just a simple shower. In the Meccan camp, the rain turned the sandy ground into thick, heavy mud, making it hard for their cavalry and soldiers to move quickly. But on the higher ground of the believers' position, the sand was packed down, firming up the soil and providing fresh water for drinking and purification. The same rain, the same night, had completely different effects on the two sides. A miracle, or just brilliant positioning? Maybe both. The sun rises on the 17th day of Ramadan. The two sides are now visible to each other. The contrast is stark. The believers, though few, are disciplined, rested, and clean. The Meccans are loud, numerous, and already struggling with the mud and the lack of easy water. The prophet took his final step. He walked the battlefield, pointing to specific spots and saying, "This is the place where so-and-so will be killed." It wasn't guesswork. It was a final injection of confidence and a prophecy to solidify the faith of his men. His final instruction was simple, but genius for a small army. He said, "Do not charge until I give the order. And when you do fight, let your arrows be your last line of defense. Only fight those who fight you and save your strength." This was a strategy of defense, discipline, and maximizing every single move. They were not fighting to take ground. They were fighting to survive and disrupt. The wait is over. The talking is done. We have the believers holding the line, ready to die for a cause. We have the Meccans marching confidently towards their own disaster. The battle starts with a tradition, a one-on-one duel, 3 champions from each side. And this duel is a perfect snapshot of everything this battle was about: skill, pride, and the ultimate price of arrogance. This next part is pure adrenaline. The battle always starts this way in the Arabian tradition, with a duel. 3 champions from the Quraysh army swaggered forward. They were famous: Utbah, his brother Shaiba, and his son Al-Walid. 3 of the most feared fighters in all of Arabia. They yelled their challenges across the field. From the believers' side, 3 men stepped out, but they were simple Ansars from Medina. The Meccans rejected them, shouting, "We only want to fight our equals, our own kin." This detail is super important. The Quraysh wanted to make this personal. So 3 men from the Prophet's own clan, 3 men who had been persecuted for 10 years by these very people, stepped forward. They were Hamza, the Prophet's uncle, a man of immense strength and courage; Ali, the Prophet's cousin, a young man barely in his 20s; and Ubaidah. What happened next was fast. Hamza faced Utbah. With one swift, powerful move, Hamza defeated him. Ali, the young cousin, faced al-Walid. Again, a quick, clean victory. The famous warriors of Mecca were dropping like flies. Ubaidah fought Shaiba, and both were severely wounded. Hamza and Ali immediately turned and finished off Shaiba, carrying their own injured companion back to the lines. The effect of this opening exchange on the Meccan army was devastating. Their three greatest champions, the symbols of their strength and history, were killed in minutes by a group they called hungry beggars. On the other hand, the believers felt a surge of energy. Their prophet's word, his promise, was starting to come true. They had a feeling that God was on their side. Seeing their champions fall, the rest of the Meccan army lost control. Abu Jahl, furious and shamed, ordered a full, disorganized charge. 1,000 soldiers with 100 horses rushed the small band of 313. This is the moment of truth. The prophet was still in his tent praying, but he was also directing the defense. The believers stood their ground, shoulder to shoulder, maintaining their formation. The Meccans, heavy with armor and struggling with the mud, were an easy target. The small army of 313 fought with the desperation of people who knew they had nothing to lose. Every man fought not just for himself, but for the life of his entire community. Finally, the prophet felt the time was right. He grabbed a handful of pebbles and sand, walked out of his tent, and threw them towards the Meccan army, saying, "May their faces be ruined." This was the signal. He then gave the ultimate order: charge them. The believers surged forward. They fought like men possessed. Remember, they were fighting people who had tormented them for 10 years. This wasn't just a battle, it was the release of a decade of oppression. Hamza, Ali, and others cut through the ranks of the enemy like a hot knife through butter. This is the point in the story where the laws of war, and maybe even the laws of physics, seem to bend. We are 3-1, remember? And the smaller force is winning. How? This is where the story goes from a battle to a miracle. The sheer chaos and the sudden, overwhelming feeling of defeat that hit the Meccans, it has to be seen to understand. We'll look at the ultimate turning point next, and trust me, you won't believe what happens to the leader of the opposing army. The Meccan army suddenly began to panic. They were fighting hard, but they couldn't land a decisive blow. They felt disorganized. They felt something was wrong. Historical accounts talk about a strange, powerful wind that began to blow against the faces of the Meccan soldiers. Imagine fighting with dust and sand, constantly blinding you, while the enemy seems unaffected. This is the part of the story the believers remember most. They testified that they saw strange things. They talked about white-robed figures fighting beside them. They claimed to see flashes of light and hear unfamiliar voices directing them. They described fighting an enemy and seeing another, unseen force strike them down before they could even raise a sword. For the believers, this was the clear, undeniable help from God promised to them earlier. For the Meccans, it was a terrifying, incomprehensible wave of confusion and panic. The battle shifted from a clash of ranks to a collapse of morale. The believers knew that to truly win, they had to cut off the head of the snake, Abu Jahl. He was the entire source of the war, the most prideful and cruel of their persecutors. And this is a truly shocking moment. 2 young men, 2 boys really, from the Ansar, named Muaz ibn Amr and Muaz ibn Afra, made it their mission to find him. They found Abu Jahl, surrounded by his bodyguards. Muaz ibn Amr charged first, striking Abu Jahl so hard he knocked his leg off.
The guards immediately pounced on Muaz, nearly cutting off his arm. He didn't stop, but hung his nearly severed arm behind him and kept fighting. Then the second young man, Muaz ibn Afra, charged and struck a decisive blow. The two young men, fighting with incredible courage, brought down the most powerful man in Mecca. When Abu Jahl fell, the entire Meccan army lost all will to fight. Their leader, the one who promised total destruction, was lying dead in the mud. The prophecy of the prophet on the morning of the battle had come true. The panic turned into a full, terrified rout. The Meccan army threw down their weapons and ran for their lives, scattering into the desert toward Mecca. When the dust settled, the count was impossible. The small, weary band of 313 believers had lost only 14 men. 14! The mighty army of 1,000 had lost around 70 men, including almost all of their top leaders and most powerful generals. They also captured 70 prisoners. The odds were flipped completely. The small group not only survived, they completely shattered the power structure of their greatest enemy. This victory wasn't just a battle won, it was a revolution. It proved that numbers and weapons don't always win. It proved that discipline, faith, and a willingness to die for your cause can completely overpower arrogance and wealth. But the story doesn't end here. The victory created a whole new set of problems that required a level of humanity and kindness that was completely new to the Arabian
Peninsula. And the way they handled their prisoners is the second great lesson of Badr. They had 70 prisoners. These were the men who had tortured, starved, and driven the believers out of their homes. Revenge was expected. Vengeance was the law of the land. The prophet called a meeting to decide what to do with them. Two main options were put forward: execution or ransom. Umar, one of the prophet's fiercest companions, was for execution. He saw them as a danger that must be completely removed. But Abu Bakr, a gentle and thoughtful companion, suggested ransom. He argued that they were relatives and that the believers needed the money to strengthen their growing state. The prophet ultimately chose the path of mercy and practicality: ransom. But the ransom came with a very clever and humane twist. If a prisoner was poor and couldn't afford to pay his ransom, he could earn his freedom by doing something amazing. He had to teach 10 people from Medina how to read and write. In a land where literacy was rare, this was a stroke of genius. The enemies of the faith were literally forced to become the educators of the community. They were rebuilding the community they had tried to destroy. This wasn't just mercy, it was nation building. The Battle of Badr changed everything. Before Badr, the community in Medina was seen as a small, weak, temporary phenomenon. After Badr, they were a force. They had a military victory against a superior enemy. They had a moral victory in their treatment of prisoners. The message was clear. This new way of life was here to stay. It gave them credibility, resources, and the confidence to continue building their society. So what's the big takeaway? The core lesson of Badr is not about fighting, but about attitude. It's about facing impossible odds. It's about not letting the sheer size of your challenge make you quit. Every single person in that small army was faced with a choice: to run back to safety or to stand their ground. They chose to stand. They chose dedication over comfort.
The story of the believers rests on three pillars we can all learn from. 1. Strategy over strength. They didn't just pray, they were smart. They controlled the water. They fought on their ground. Strategy beats brute force every single time. 2. Unity over fear. When Saad spoke up and said, "We will fight with you," the fear disappeared. Find the people who will stand with you when the odds are stacked and you can achieve anything. 3. Mercy after victory. They didn't become the tyrants they had fought. They showed humanity, and by doing so, they won something even bigger than a battle. They won respect and a moral high ground that lasts forever. Badr is the moment when a dream was almost crushed, but instead it was cemented into history. It's a story about 313 ordinary people who chose to believe in something bigger than their fear. Every single one of us has a Badr moment. We all face that one giant 1,000-man problem that makes us want to run away. The question is, when your moment comes, will you stand with the 313? The story of the believers is only just starting here. The Quraysh didn't give up. The next year they came back, stronger and angrier, for a rematch that shook the community to its foundations. To find out what happened next and see how the believers handled their next life or death moment, make sure you are subscribed. Leave a comment below with which detail of Badr surprised you the most. We'll see you in the next chapter.